In the 16th century, the Catholic Church raised enough money to build the largest cathedral on earth by selling slips of paper that promised buyers a faster route through the afterlife. The product was invisible, the delivery was unverifiable, and the marketing worked on a continental scale. But here is the uncomfortable part. This wasn't a con grafted onto Christianity from the outside. It was Christianity's own internal logic, followed to its natural conclusion by a pope who simply decided to put a number on what had always been implied. So why did it take one German monk with a list of complaints to make the entire transaction feel unbearable? And why did the backlash not clean up the church but instead crack the Western world in two? In the year 1517, a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel was traveling the roads of Germany with a strongbox and a sales pitch that would have impressed a modern venture capitalist. The pitch was simple. You give him money, God forgives you, possibly also your dead relatives. Tetzel had a jingle for it, which history has preserved with the kind of gleeful embarrassment usually reserved for old holiday commercials. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Catchy. Theologically debatable. Enormously profitable. What Tetzel was selling were indulgences, official church documents that reduced the time a soul spent suffering in purgatory before reaching heaven. They arrived on thick vellum stamped with wax seals still warm from the press, signed with quills that scratched across the page with the satisfying weight of ecclesiastical authority. They looked serious. They looked official. They looked, above all, like something you would want to own. The product had one small limitation, which was that no customer could ever verify they had received it. Don't worry, it gets worse. Because the money from Tetzel's tour and from hundreds of similar operations running across Europe was not funding hospitals or orphanages or famine relief. It was funding the most expensive building project on the continent. The new saint. Peter's Basilica in Rome was under construction, a replacement for the old 4th century church that Pope Julius II had decided was not quite magnificent enough for the seat of Christendom. The new design called for a dome that would scrape the Roman sky, marble floors that would take generations of workers to lay, and a budget that would require, among other creative solutions, the systematic monetization of the afterlife. Stand inside Peter's today and the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. The nave stretches so far that the figures at the far end look like toys. The dome soars 136 meters above the floor. Michelangelo worked on it. Bernini worked on it. The whole thing took over 120 years to complete and cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions in modern currency. The building is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary human achievements in recorded history. It was also, in meaningful part, purchased with receipts for a product located in another dimension. Here is the detail that tends to stop people cold. This was not a scam in the shadows, run by fraudsters hiding from the church. This was the church, operating through its official machinery with papal authorization, doing exactly what the system was designed to do. The sale of indulgences had been theologically justified, institutionally organized, and administratively refined over centuries. Tetzel was not a rogue agent. He was a contractor with a contract. Which raises a question worth sitting with as we go further into this story. At what point does a system stop being corrupt and simply become the system? That question did not go unasked. In fact, someone nailed it to a door. Purgatory was not a metaphor. Let's be clear about that. For a medieval Christian living in, say, the year 1200, heaven, hell, and purgatory were as geographically real as France. Heaven was up. Hell was down. Purgatory sat somewhere in between, a vast processing zone where souls burned off the residue of their earthly sins before they were clean enough for God's presence. The heat was described in church literature as genuine fire. The duration could stretch for thousands of years. Your grandmother was possibly in there right now, and the thought of it kept people awake on cold stone nights in ways that no modern anxiety quite replicates. This cosmology was not accidental. It was load-bearing architecture. Because if purgatory exists, sin has a cost that survives death. And if sin has a cost, someone needs to help you pay it. Enter the sacrament of penance, one of the Church's 7 sacraments and easily its most economically productive. The formula had 3 parts: contrition, the genuine sorrow for sin; confession, the verbal admission to a priest; and satisfaction, the acts performed to balance the spiritual ledger. Contrition and confession were internal and essentially free. Satisfaction was where things got interesting. Early satisfaction was physical: fasting, pilgrimage, flagellation. The kind of spiritual payment that cost the penitent something measurable in sweat and blisters. But over time, satisfaction became, let us say, flexible. Prayers could substitute for pilgrimages. Donations could substitute for prayers. The ledger remained. The currency evolved. The theological machinery that made this work cleanly was called the treasury of merit. The logic ran like this: Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the saints had lived such extraordinarily holy lives that they had accumulated surplus righteousness, more goodness than they personally needed for salvation. This surplus did not evaporate. It sat, accumulated in a kind of divine reserve account, administered by the Pope as spiritual treasurer of the Church. A Pope could draw on this treasury to supplement a sinner's insufficient personal merit. That transfer was an indulgence. The Crusades were where this concept first got really practical. Pope Urban II, preaching the First Crusade in 1095, offered soldiers full remission of penance for taking up arms in the Holy Land. No years of fasting. No barefoot pilgrimages. Just armor, a cross stitched to your surcoat, and several hundred miles of extremely dangerous travel eastward. Same spiritual result. It was, in fairness, a reasonable trade at the time. The problem, as it tends to be with reasonable trades, was where the logic went next. By the mid-1400s, the holiest church in Christendom smelled like a building that had given up. Peter's Basilica had been standing since the Emperor Constantine commissioned it around the year 326. Over 1,000 years of Roman reign, medieval neglect, and the occasional anti-pope had left their mark. The walls leaned. Not metaphorically, not slightly. They had drifted nearly 6 feet out of vertical, which is the kind of structural confession that makes architects go very quiet. The foundations, built partly over Nero's old circus and the marshy soil of the Vatican Hill, were cracking. The roof sagged. Pilgrims arriving from across Europe to kneel at the tomb of St. Peter were greeted by a building that appeared to be slowly but sincerely returning itself to the earth. Pope Nicholas V looked at this situation in 1452 and decided something had to be done. He commissioned the architect Leon Battista Alberti to assess the damage. Alberti's report was, by all accounts, not encouraging. The south wall was the worst offender, leaning so dramatically outward that repair was barely distinguishable from fantasy. Nicholas sketched an ambitious rebuilding plan, something massive, something worthy of Rome's recovered prestige. Then he died in 1455, and the project died with him, because that is how renovation projects work. For the next 50 years, various popes patched, worried, and quietly looked the other way. Then came Julius II. Julius was not a man who patched things. Elected in 1503, he was the kind of pope who wore armor on campaign and had Michelangelo's phone number. In 1506, he made a decision that shocked even the people who thought they understood him. He would not restore old St. Peter's. He would demolish it entirely and build something the world had never seen. His architect, Donato Bramante, drew up a floor plan in the shape of a Greek cross, 4 equal arms radiating from a central dome so vast it would dwarf the Pantheon. The estimated cost was staggering, somewhere in the range of what a small nation might spend on a war, which was fitting, because Julius was also spending heavily on several actual wars at the same time. Bramante, the locals noted with some affection, earned his nickname quickly. They called him Ruinante, the destroyer. The old Basilica, with its mosaic saints and 1,200 years of accumulated candle smoke, began coming down. Someone, of course, was going to have to pay for what went up in its place. Giovanni de' Medici received his cardinal's hat at 13 years old, which is the age most boys are worried about considerably smaller problems. He came from the family that had essentially invented Renaissance excess. The Medici Bank had financed popes, kings, and enough artistic masterpieces to fill several museums that would not exist for another 4 centuries. Giovanni grew up surrounded by Botticelli paintings, Platonic philosophy, and the working assumption that beauty was a birthright. He was educated alongside the finest minds Florence could produce, which was, at that particular moment in history, quite a statement. When he was elected Pope in 1513 at 37 years old, the story goes that he turned to his brother Giuliano and said, "With the serenity of a man entirely at peace with himself, since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Historians debate whether he actually said this. What is not debatable is that he acted as though he had. Leo X's Rome was a banquet that never quite ended. His dinner parties were theatrical productions, sometimes literally, with performances, poets, and enough food that the logistics alone required a small army of servants. He kept a pet elephant named Hanno, a gift from the King of Portugal, which wandered Vatican grounds with the calm dignity of someone who understood they were the most interesting person in any room. He hunted with enormous enthusiasm, patronized Raphael so generously that the painter's studio became something close to a papal extension, and spent money with the focused commitment of a man who genuinely believed the treasury was a suggestion. The problem was the treasury. Julius II, his predecessor and one of history's great overachievers, had managed to drain the papal coffers through the dual passions of military campaigning and architectural ambition. He had launched the most expensive building project in Christendom and also personally led armies into battle, which is a budgeting strategy with predictable results. By the time Leo settled into the papal apartments, the finances of the church were in a condition that could be described, generously, as creative. The half-built skeleton of the new St. Peter's sat on the Vatican Hill like an extremely holy construction site, which is precisely what it was. Bramante was dead. Raphael had taken over the architectural work. The dome Julius had dreamed about existed mainly as ambition and scaffolding. And the bills, like the walls of the old Basilica, were not going anywhere. Leo needed money. A great deal of it. And he had inherited from his predecessors a product with remarkably broad appeal, the indulgence. The church had been selling indulgences for centuries. These certificates that reduced the time a soul spent in purgatory, documents of divine accounting. Leo understood that what this system lacked was not theology but scale. What if the operation were expanded, aggressively marketed across the whole of Northern Europe, managed through banking partnerships with the efficiency the Medici name implied? What followed was not a quiet fundraiser. And somewhere in Germany, a theology professor with strong opinions about debt, penance, and the appropriate relationship between heaven and cash was about to pick up a pen. Johann Tetzel had done this before. By the time Archbishop Albert of Mainz hired him to run the Great Indulgence Campaign of 1517, Tetzel was already a seasoned professional, a Dominican friar who had spent years crisscrossing Saxony with a strong voice, a gift for emotional theater, and an almost supernatural ability to separate a grieving parent from their coins. Albert of Mainz needed him because Albert of Mainz had a problem. He had paid the papacy an enormous bribe to hold 3 church offices simultaneously, a practice technically forbidden and practically common. The sum was around 10,000 ducats, which he had borrowed from the Fugger banking house of Augsburg, the Renaissance equivalent of a financial institution that could repossess a bishop if he missed a payment. The deal was elegant in its corruption. Leo X would authorize a special indulgence sale in Albert's territories. Half the proceeds would go to Rome for St. Peter's. The other half would go directly back to Albert to repay the Fuggers. The soul-saving business was, in other words, a debt instrument. Tetzel's job was to make people forget any of that. And here is the thing, he was extraordinary at it. When Tetzel arrived in a town, he did not quietly set up a table. He processed. A papal cross was carried ahead of him, gilded, rising above the crowd. A banner bearing Leo's coat of arms followed. The church bells rang. By the time Tetzel himself appeared, the atmosphere was closer to a coronation than a transaction. He understood that people do not hand over money for paperwork. They hand it over for feeling. His sermons were built around a specific, almost unbearable image. Your mother, he would tell the gathered crowds. Your father. Your child. Right now, at this moment, they are in purgatory, suffering, burning, calling out to you. Imagine the sound of that, the smell of it. And you, standing here, have the means to help them for the price of a coin. You would buy a stranger a meal. Would you not buy your own mother's peace? Congregations wept. And then they paid. The famous jingle, which Tetzel either coined or popularized, compressed the theology into something a child could memorize. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was, by any measure, the most effective advertising copy of the 15th century, and possibly several centuries on either side of it. Catchy, emotionally manipulative, and theologically questionable. The complete package. The pricing structure deserves its own appreciation. Tetzel did not offer a flat rate. Kings and nobles paid the most, several gold florins for the premium tier. Merchants paid a middling sum. Peasants could access a more modest certificate for a few silver coins, because salvation, like most products, needed a mass market option to really move volume. The church was not leaving money on the table based on income bracket. More remarkable still was the special category for sins not yet committed. For a sufficiently large payment, a buyer could theoretically pre-purchase forgiveness for future transgressions. The implications of this, spiritually speaking, were worth pondering. Tetzel was essentially offering a subscription service for the conscience. The money moved through the campaign like water downhill into strongboxes supervised by Fugger agents who traveled with Tetzel's entourage to ensure the banking house received its share before the coins grew cold. It was a precise, professional operation, one that combined medieval piety with early modern financial infrastructure, and it worked. Towns that had never seen anything like it were left lighter in the purse and, according to the sales pitch, lighter in the soul. The only people who seemed unbothered by any of this were the men running it. About 30 miles away from one of Tetzel's most enthusiastic performances, in the university town of Wittenberg, a professor named Martin Luther was listening to his parishioners describe what they had witnessed. His expression, if you could have seen it, was probably not one of approval. That conversation between an aggressive salesman and a furious theologian was about to reshape the Western world. The indulgence certificate that a German farmer held in his hands in 1517 was a real, physical object, and it deserves a moment of respectful attention. It was parchment, not paper. Heavier, slightly waxy to the touch, with a smell somewhere between old leather and dust. The text was printed because Gutenberg's press had made mass production possible, but the important parts were filled in by hand: the buyer's name, the date, the location, the specific sins to be remitted. A red wax seal pressed into the bottom completed the effect. Official, permanent, yours. For the farmer who bought it, this was not a receipt. It was a deed to something he desperately wanted. Consider the emotional weight of that transaction, which tends to get lost when historians focus on the accounting. The Church's teaching on purgatory was not abstract theology to a medieval peasant. It was the destination of everyone he had ever loved. His wife dead in childbirth. His father gone without last rites. His child taken by fever before the age of reason. These were not metaphors. These were people, and they were, by the cosmology he had been raised inside, suffering right now in a state of painful purification, waiting. The indulgence certificate said it could help them. Of course he bought it. He would have been a monster not to. He walked home with the parchment and very likely felt relief. That coin, warm from his pocket, then traveled in directions he never knew about. The Fugger banking house of Augsburg, which by this point was the closest thing Europe had to an international financial institution, had positioned agents directly inside Tetzel's operation. They did not wait for the money to arrive in Rome. They collected at the source, taking their cut from every strongbox before it moved an inch toward the Vatican. This was not informal. It was contractual. The Fuggers had lent Archbishop Albert of Mainz around 10,000 ducats to purchase his church offices, and the indulgence campaign was the agreed repayment mechanism. The split was precise. Half of all proceeds went to Rome for St. Peter's construction. The other half went back to Albert, who forwarded it to the Fuggers, which meant that for every coin a farmer pressed into the collection box hoping to ease his grandmother's time in purgatory, roughly half of it was paying down a bishop's real estate debt to a banking family in Augsburg. The Fuggers kept meticulous records. They always did. Renaissance banking was built on the ledger, and the Fuggers ran some of the most detailed ledgers in Europe. Somewhere in their accounts, the piety of an entire generation of German Christians appears as a line item. The indulgence campaign was, in the end, a financial instrument wearing investments. It had genuine believers at one end, genuinely frightened for their families. It had Fugger accountants at the other, genuinely indifferent to all of that. The parchment with the red seal connected those two worlds without either one fully seeing the other. What it could not do, it turned out, was operate quietly forever. A professor in Wittenberg was already drafting something, 95 points of argument, that would force the entire machinery into the light. Martin Luther was afraid of thunderstorms in a way that changed the world. In July of 1505, caught in a violent storm near Stotternheim, the 21-year-old law student made a promise to Saint Anne, "Spare my life, and I will become a monk." He survived. He kept his promise. His father was furious. And Luther, now inside the walls of an Augustinian monastery in Erfurt, began a decade-long battle with a question that would not leave him alone. How could a person ever be certain they were saved? He fasted. He confessed constantly, sometimes for hours at a stretch, cataloging sins so minor that his confessor reportedly found him exhausting. He was brilliant, devout, and genuinely terrified that no amount of effort would ever be sufficient. By 1512, he was a theology professor at the newly founded University of Wittenberg, lecturing on Paul's letters, and still wrestling with the same knot of anxiety he had carried since the monastery. Then his parishioners started coming back from Johann Tetzel's roadshow clutching their parchment certificates, and something shifted. They were not troubled. That was the problem. They were comfortable, relieved, finished. Some reportedly told Luther in confession that they had no need to repent of anything, because the indulgence had already settled the matter. One certificate, properly purchased, had apparently replaced the entire interior work of contrition. For a man who had spent years in spiritual agony trying to understand grace, this was not a minor theological wrinkle. It was an insult to everything the gospel meant. He wrote 95 theses in Latin. This is important because the popular image, Luther as revolutionary firebrand storming the church door, gets the tone completely wrong. The theses were an academic document, dense with scholastic argument, written in the language of university debate, intended for other theologians. He was not trying to start a revolution. He was trying to have a conversation. Points like Thesis 27, which challenged the claim that a soul flies from purgatory the moment the coin rings in the box, were provocations directed at colleagues, not battle cries. Whether he actually nailed the document to the door of the castle church on October 31st, 1517 is genuinely uncertain. The dramatic hammer strike comes from a single source written decades later. What the historical record does confirm is that he mailed the theses to Archbishop Albert of Mainz. The same Albert who had borrowed heavily from the Fuggers and needed the indulgence proceeds to pay them back. Asking Albert to reform the indulgence system was, in hindsight, a little like asking a man to saw off the branch he is sitting on. Albert was not persuaded. But the printing press was listening. Within weeks, the theses had been translated into German and reproduced across the continent. Not because Luther planned it, not because any institution coordinated it, but because printers recognized a sensation when they saw one. The technology that had made indulgence certificates affordable to produce now turned a professor's academic grievances into a firestorm that reached every literate household in Europe. Luther had mailed the letter. The press lit it on fire and threw it through every window it could find. What happened next? The church's response, the escalating confrontation, and one famous moment in a room in Worms was no longer in anyone's control. Pope Leo X reportedly heard about the German monk's theses, smiled, and said something along the lines of, "A drunken German who will think differently when sober," which is a wonderfully comfortable thing to believe. It is also the kind of dismissal that tends to age very badly. Leo was a Medici. He had grown up surrounded by art, philosophy, and the refined conviction that Florence produced the finest minds in Christendom. He had been made an archbishop at 8 years old, a cardinal at 13, and pope at 37. He understood power as a cultural performance, a thing of marble and gold leaf and exquisitely managed patronage. A theology professor in Saxony with a printing problem was not, in his estimation, a serious matter. Rome waited for the sobering up. It did not come. By 1519, Luther stood in Leipzig facing Johann Eck, one of the church's sharpest debaters, in a formal disputation that lasted days in the summer heat. The hall smelled of sweat and candle smoke and the particular tension of a crowd that knows it is watching something important. Eck, methodical and clever, maneuvered Luther into a corner. Did he stand with Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer burned at the Council of Constance a century earlier? Because Luther's arguments sounded familiar. Luther backed into the corner, looked at Huss's condemned writings and said, essentially, yes. Some of them are correct. And with that, he had denied not just papal authority but the infallibility of church councils themselves. There was no institutional floor left beneath him. Rome stopped laughing. In June of 1520, Leo issued the papal bull Exsurge Damen, rising, O Lord, against the wild boar ravaging the vineyard. It listed 41 errors in Luther's work and gave him 60 days to recant or face excommunication. The document arrived in Germany with all the weight of 1,000 years of papal authority behind it. Luther received it, read it, walked to the Elster Gate in Wittenberg on December 10th, 1520, and burned it. In public. With witnesses. The crowd that gathered in the cold morning air watched him feed a document signed by the Bishop of Rome into a fire, then reportedly said, "Since you have corrupted the truth of God, may God destroy you in this fire." Not a drunken man having second thoughts. A theologian who had made his decision. The Diet of Worms in April 1521 was, in theory, a chance for resolution. Luther stood before Emperor Charles V, the assembled princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and the full machinery of secular and ecclesiastical authority, surrounded by the smell of wax and polished armor, and was asked one simple question. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. He could not be touched inside the hall. Outside was a different matter. His friend and protector, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, arranged a fake kidnapping on the road home. Luther vanished into the Wartburg Castle, where he would spend months in hiding, growing a beard, translating the New Testament into German, and occasionally throwing his inkwell at what he described as the devil. The church had its condemnation. Luther had his Bible translation and a head start. What came next was not a debate. It was a fracture. The fracture did not stay neat. Fractures never do. Within a decade of Luther's stand at Worms, the Reformation he'd started had multiplied into something he no longer controlled. Ulrich Zwingli was dismantling Catholic practice in Zurich by 1523, stripping churches bare. arguing that anything not explicitly commanded in Scripture had to go. Stained glass, organ music, the Mass itself. Out. Meanwhile, a French theologian named John Calvin was building something colder and more systematic in Geneva, a theology of predestination so logically airtight it gave people the spiritual comfort of a steel trap. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Zwinglianism. The Protestant movement was already arguing with itself, which, in fairness, is a very Protestant thing to do. And then the peasants got ideas. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 was, depending on your perspective, either the logical conclusion of Lutheran theology or its most catastrophic misreading. Peasants across the German territories had heard the language of Christian freedom, of Scripture over tradition, of the corrupt authority of Rome. They applied it to the corrupt authority of their landlords. Reasonable enough. Really. They produced the 12 Articles, a remarkably moderate list of grievances, the right to choose their own pastors, the abolition of serfdom, fair rents. Luther, initially sympathetic, watched the revolt turn violent and did what intellectuals sometimes do when their ideas escape the seminar room. He panicked. He published Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants, urging the nobility to cut them down without mercy. The nobility obliged. Somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 peasants were killed. Luther's reputation among the poor never fully recovered. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534. The official reason was theological. The actual reason was that Pope Clement VII would not annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, partly because Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor and had recently held Clement prisoner. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England and solved his marriage problem domestically. Convenient. Remarkably convenient. Rome, finally, did something it should have done decades earlier. The Council of Trent, running from 1545 to 1563, addressed the abuses that had fueled the whole catastrophe. The selling of indulgences was curtailed. Clergy were required to actually live in their dioceses. The theology was clarified and tightened. It was thoughtful, rigorous reform. It was also about 40 years too late. Western Christendom had cracked permanently, and no council, however thorough, was going to press those pieces back together. The question now was how much blood the crack would cost, and that is a question best saved for another evening. Bramantes's original design for the new St. Peter's called for a perfect Greek cross. 4 equal arms radiating from a central dome, a vision so geometrically pure it must have looked, on paper, like. Then Bramante died in 1514, and the arguments started. They lasted 120 years. Raphael inherited the project and stretched the cross into a Latin one, adding a nave for processions. Then Raphael died at 37, which was very inconvenient. Antonio da Sangallo the Younger took over, built a scale model the size of a small house, held the job for decades, and then also died. This was becoming a pattern. The Basilica was not merely a construction site. It was a graveyard of ambitions, a place where brilliant men came to leave their mark and then, frequently, leave everything else as well. The sack of Rome in 1527 didn't help. When the unpaid troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V tore through the city, looting, burning, committing horrors that eyewitnesses described with the stunned vocabulary of people who had no vocabulary for it, construction essentially stopped. Workers fled. Funds evaporated. The half-built skeleton of the basilica stood in the Roman weather and waited, patient as stone tends to be. Don't worry, it gets worse. Then it gets magnificent. In 1547, Pope Paul III asked Michelangelo Buonarroti to take over as chief architect. Michelangelo was 71 years old. He had already painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, sculpted David, sculpted the Pieta, and done roughly enough work for 4 ordinary human lifetimes. He agreed to finish the basilica on one condition: he would accept no payment. Not a single scudo. He called it his gift to God and to St. Peter, a devotional act, a penance perhaps, for all the glory he'd received and all the sin he suspected lurked beneath it. Imagine the weight of that commitment. An old man, his hands stiffening, climbing scaffolding in the Roman cold, working without salary on the largest church in Christendom as an act of personal prayer. He simplified Sangallo's overcomplicated design, returned to Bramante's domed vision, and drew the dome. He did not live to see it built. He died in 1564, and Giacomo della Porta completed the dome in 1590, steepening its curve slightly, giving it the silhouette that still defines the Roman skyline. Stand in any of a dozen spots across the city and there it is, the tallest dome in the world at the time of its completion, floating above the rooftops like an argument that God exists and has excellent taste in architecture. Gian Lorenzo Bernini added the great colonnade, those sweeping arms of columns that reach out from the facade like the church itself opening its embrace to the faithful. By 1626, Pope Urban VIII consecrated the finished basilica, 120 years after Julius II had swung the first ceremonial pickaxe into the old Constantinian floor. The building could hold 60,000 worshippers. It was funded by indulgences, by guilt, by politics, and by the stubborn refusal of successive popes to let the idea die. And what became of all that guilt money, all that Protestant fury, all that broken Christendom? That question was just getting interesting. Here is the honest question no one in the 16th century was allowed to ask out loud. Did it work? Not theologically. Set theology aside for a moment. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than that. When a German wool merchant handed over his coins to Johann Tetzel's traveling indulgence booth in 1517, when he watched the paper certificate being rolled and sealed, when he walked home through the mud and cold holding proof of reduced time in purgatory for his dead mother, did he feel better? Almost certainly, yes. Did that feeling mean anything? That is where things get complicated. The church, whether it intended to or not, had identified something profound about the human mind. Certainty is a product. Not knowledge, not truth, certainty. The feeling of having handled a problem, of having converted formless dread into a transaction with a receipt. The merchant could not verify his mother's soul had been relieved of a single day's suffering. No one could. That was, in a way, the genius of the whole arrangement. The product was untestable. There were no returns, no customer complaints logged, no audit possible. The church held a complete monopoly on the afterlife as a market, and in any monopoly, the seller sets the terms. This is, it should be noted, terrifyingly efficient as a business model. The system persisted for centuries not because people were foolish, but because it answered something real. Death is terrifying. Grief is unbearable. The idea that a loved one might be suffering somewhere unreachable, that you had the power to help them but simply hadn't yet, that guilt sits in the chest like cold iron. Indulgences dissolved it. They said, here is a concrete action you can take. Here is a price. Here is your receipt. You have done something. The relief that followed was genuine, even if its theological foundations were, let us say, creatively interpreted. The church had monetized the gap between what humans can control and what they cannot. That gap has never closed. Consider the modern equivalents and try to do so without too much defensiveness. The wellness retreat that promises to reset your nervous system for $3,000. The premium subscription that offers for a monthly fee, guided meditations and a sleep score, and the gentle suggestion that you are now managing your anxiety. The carbon offset that allows a long-haul flight to feel morally neutral. The therapy app that provides the sensation of progress without the inconvenience of actual change. These are not precisely frauds. The relief they offer is often genuine. The product is real in its way. The product is the feeling of having done something in the face of something that cannot be controlled. The uncomfortable parallel is not that modern wellness culture is as corrupt as Renaissance indulgence peddling. The uncomfortable parallel is that the human need being served is identical. We are still buying certainty. We are still paying to convert existential dread into a manageable transaction. We are still, in some fundamental sense, handing coins across a booth for a piece of paper that says, "You have handled this." The thin line between genuine relief and exploitation has never been easy to locate. Tetzel was, by most accounts, a man who pushed hard past that line, promising things even Catholic theology did not technically endorse, performing financial theater in market squares. But the local priest offering a quiet indulgence to a grieving widow, was he exploiting her? Or was he providing the only comfort his world had available? The answer is probably both, which is the honest answer to most questions about how humans treat each other. The wool merchant walked home feeling lighter. His mother's soul may or may not have benefited. His coin was already heading north toward Rome, where the dome was still just a drawing, just a hope, just a promise on paper. Which, when you consider it, is exactly what he had purchased for himself. The indulgence system found its loudest critic in a single monk, nailing paper to a door in a small German town, and what happened next divided the Western world in ways that are still quietly unresolved. 16 million people walk through St. Peter's Basilica every year. They come in from the Roman heat or the Roman rain, and they stop. Almost everyone stops. The scale of the nave does something to human posture, something involuntary. Shoulders drop. Heads tilt back. The marble floor, cold and pale, and so polished it holds a faint reflection of everyone who has ever crossed it, stretches ahead like a small country. It is genuinely, almost aggressively, beautiful. Michelangelo's dome climbs 136 meters into the air above the high altar. The light comes through in columns, the kind of light that looks intentional, the kind that makes people reach for their phones and then hesitate, sensing that the photograph will not survive the translation. The air inside smells of stone and candles and the particular cool that only very old, very thick walls can produce. Somewhere, always, there is an echo of footsteps that doesn't quite match the person walking. This is what the money bought. And the money came from grief. The irony worth sitting with is this: the backlash against indulgences did not end the commerce of spiritual reassurance. It relocated it. The Reformation built its own structures, its own authorities, its own mechanisms for telling frightened people that they were probably on the correct side of eternity. The vendors changed. The need they were serving did not move an inch. So here we are, standing on that cold marble, craning toward that dome, holding the full weight of it. The quill that signed the certificates. The wax seal, pressed and cooling. The sound of hammers over a century of construction, now long gone quiet beneath the sound of tourist footsteps and soft, reverent murmuring. Every surface in this room was paid for by someone who was afraid of dying, and who did not have any other available response to that fear. That discomfort is not a reason to look away from the beauty. The beauty is real. The dome is real. The cold of the floor through the soles of your shoes is real. But the full experience of standing in Peter's Basilica, the honest one, includes knowing what the transaction was. We are still buying things we cannot verify we have received. We have always done this. We will, in all likelihood, continue. The dome stands. The receipts are gone. The fear that generated them is as present as it ever was, wearing different clothes, spending in different currencies, finding new booths at the edge of new market squares. Some things, it turns out, are eternal.